Me as the moment the headline dropped, the internet didn't just react, it exploded. Because nobody expected the man who once promised forever on national television to end up standing in handcuffs with a $600,000 verdict hanging over his name like a storm cloud that refused to pass. And just when viewers were still processing the shock of Daniel's arrest, screenshots of a lavish wedding announcement began circulating online, complete with smiling photos and captions about new beginnings, which made everything feel even more surreal. Because how does someone go from courtroom drama to happily ever after in what feels like the same breath, and suddenly everyone thought they had the story figured out? The villain was obvious. The victim was clear. The narrative was clean and simple. Except it wasn't. Because when money and love collide, especially inside the chaotic universe of 90-Day Fiancé, nothing is ever just black and white. And the deeper you look, the more uncomfortable the questions become. Because yes, the 600K verdict sounds definitive. It sounds like justice served. It sounds like a scam exposed, but real relationships are rarely built on a single headline. And what made this case different wasn't just the amount of money or the arrest itself. It was how fast public opinion formed and how confidently everyone declared they knew the truth before the full story even had a chance to breathe. Before we break this down piece by piece, welcome back to TLC Drama Live, where we don't just repeat headlines. We analyze behavior, power dynamics, and the uncomfortable truths hiding underneath reality TV romance. So, if you're new here, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. Because this story gets deeper than most people realize, and genuinely want to hear your thoughts in the comments, especially on this question. When money enters a relationship, does trust automatically weaken, or does it simply expose what was already fragile? At first glance, Lisa looked like the obvious victim. The woman who believed in a dream, invested her heart and her finances, and ended up in court trying to reclaim what she said was taken from her. And when Daniel was arrested, it felt like confirmation, like the universe had chosen a side. But then something strange started happening online. Whispers began circulating. Old clips resurfaced. Timelines were re-examined. And suddenly, people weren't as certain anymore because some viewers started asking whether Lisa had ignored red flags that were visible to everyone else, while others questioned whether Daniel's promises were truly manipulative or simply exaggerated ambition that spiraled out of control. And that's where this story stops being simple and starts becoming uncomfortable. Because if Daniel was truly guilty in the way many believed, why did parts of the audience slowly begin shifting their tone months later? Why did sympathy start spreading in unexpected directions? And why did the narrative that once felt airtight suddenly develop cracks that no one could ignore? This wasn't just about a verdict or a wedding announcement anymore. It became a battle over perception, over who controlled the story, over whether courtroom outcomes automatically equal moral clarity. And as we move forward, you're going to see that the arrest was only the surface-level shock because beneath it lies a series of decisions, secrets, and emotional blind spots that make the situation far more complicated than the internet initially decided. So, the real question isn't just whether Daniel was arrested or whether $600,000 changed hands. The real question is this. If the evidence seems so clear in the beginning, what caused public opinion to slowly turn? And what did viewers start noticing that they hadn't seen before? Before there were court documents, before there were accusations, before the number 600,000 became a symbol of betrayal, there was a dream. And not just any dream, but the kind that feels cinematic when you first hear it. The kind that makes your present reality seem temporary and small compared to the future being painted in front of you. Because Daniel didn't approach Lisa with uncertainty or hesitation. He approached her with vision, with empire talk, with confidence so steady it almost felt protective. And when someone speaks about financial security as if it's already guaranteed when they describe business ventures as though success is simply a matter of time, it creates a psychological shift that is far more powerful than most people realize. He didn't just promise love. He promised elevation. He talked about building something international, something stable, something that would make sacrifices today feel insignificant tomorrow. And that's important because future projection is one of the most persuasive tactics in human relationships, especially when it's delivered with certainty. Because the brain doesn't separate imagination from reality as cleanly as we think it does. So when Lisa heard about investments, expansion plans, and a lifestyle upgrade, she wasn't just hearing words. She was mentally stepping into that future, emotionally living inside a version of her life where stress was reduced and security was permanent. And here's where people often oversimplify the story because it's easy to say she should have known better. It's easy to say red flags were obvious, but intelligent people fall for big dreams all the time. Not because they lack logic, but because hope is persuasive. When it aligns with unmet desires. And Daniel seemed to understand urgency, too. Subtly reinforcing the idea that timing mattered, that opportunities don't wait forever, that being early in something great is how you win big, and urgency compresses decision-making. It makes hesitation feel like loss, which is a powerful emotional lever. There was also exclusivity woven into the dynamic. The suggestion that not everyone gets access to this level of ambition or this kind of the suggestion that not everyone gets access to this level of ambition or this kind of opportunity, and that made Lisa feel chosen, not just loved, but selected for something bigger than ordinary life. And when someone feels selected, they don't question as much, they commit, because walking away doesn't just feel like ending a relationship, it feels like losing access to a future that may never come again. And this is where things begin to blur, because from the outside it's easy to label confidence as manipulation, it's easy to call vision a tactic, but from the inside, when you're emotionally invested, those same qualities feel like leadership, like certainty, like someone who knows where they're going and is willing to take you there with them. So the real question becomes, at what point does confidence cross the line into deception, and more importantly, can someone be both genuine in their belief and misleading in their execution at the same time? Because as their relationship deepened, the conversations reportedly shifted. From dreams to logistics, from what we could build to what we need right now, and that shift is subtle but powerful because it moves the relationship from imagination into action, and once action begins, the stakes become real, money becomes involved, time becomes invested, and decisions start carrying consequences that can't easily be reversed. And according to the narrative that later unfolded, this is where financial involvement started taking a more serious role. Discussions about investments, business expansion, and shared financial goals began to take center stage, and from Lisa's perspective this may have felt like progress, like everything Daniel had promised was finally beginning to materialize. But from a psychological standpoint, this is also the stage where commitment bias starts to lock in, because once you invest something, whether it's time, money, or emotional energy, your brain naturally wants to justify that investment. It wants to believe that the decision was right, because admitting doubt means admitting potential loss, and loss is something the human mind is wired to avoid at almost any cost. And this is why people sometimes double down even when uncertainty starts creeping in, because pulling back feels more painful than pushing forward. And if Daniel truly believed in the vision he was presenting, then from his perspective, asking for support may not have felt like manipulation at all. It may have felt like partnership, like two people building something together, each contributing in their own way. But the complication arises when outcomes don't match expectations, because belief alone doesn't create results, and when promises begin to stretch without clear fulfillment, the same confidence that once felt reassuring can start to feel unstable. And this is where perception begins to shift slowly, at first almost imperceptibly. Small inconsistencies, questions that don't get clear answers, timelines that extend without explanation, and in many cases these early warning signs don't trigger immediate alarm because they can be explained away, rationalized, or temporarily ignored, especially when the emotional investment is already high. But over time, patterns start forming, and patterns are much harder to dismiss than isolated incidents, because they suggest something deeper, something structural rather than accidental. And this is where observers looking back often say the red flags were there from the beginning. But what's important to understand is that red flags are only obvious in hindsight. In real time, they're often subtle, ambiguous, and easily overshadowed by hope, because hope is one of the strongest emotional drivers in human behavior. It allows people to tolerate uncertainty, to overlook inconsistencies, and to keep moving forward even when clarity is missing. And as the relationship continued progressing, it's likely that both Daniel and Lisa were operating from their own internal narratives. Daniel potentially seeing himself as someone on the verge of success, someone who just needed the right support at the right moment, and Lisa seeing herself as someone who believed in that potential enough to invest in it. But when two internal narratives don't align with external reality, tension inevitably builds, and that tension doesn't always surface immediately. Sometimes it simmers beneath the surface, accumulating over time until a single event brings everything into focus. And for many viewers, that event was the arrest, because an arrest feels definitive. It feels like a moment where ambiguity disappears and reality asserts itself in the most undeniable way possible. But what makes this situation more complex is what happened after, because instead of the narrative becoming clearer, it actually became more complicated as new information began circulating, and as people revisited earlier moments with fresh perspective, suddenly the story that once seemed straightforward started to fragment into multiple interpretations. Some viewers doubled down on Their initial judgment seeing the arrest as confirmation that everything Daniel had said was built on deception, while others began questioning whether the full context had been considered, whether there were details missing, whether the situation was more nuanced than it initially appeared, and this division in perception is what transformed the situation from a simple scandal into a layered discussion about trust, accountability, and the nature of truth itself. Because in the age of social media, narratives don't just form, they evolve, influenced by new information, selective memory, and collective interpretation, and as more time passed, the initial shock of the arrest began to fade, making room for deeper analysis. People started looking beyond the headline, asking not just what happened, but how it happened and why it unfolded the way it did, and this shift from reaction to reflection is where the story truly begins to deepen, because it forces uncomfortable questions about human behavior, about how easily perception can be shaped, and about how quickly certainty can dissolve when new perspectives are introduced. And as we continue unpacking this situation, you'll start to see that what seemed like a clear-cut case at the beginning is anything but simple, because beneath the surface lies a web of motivations, decisions, and emotional dynamics that challenge the idea that any story involving money and love can ever be reduced to a single narrative. And as that web of motivations began to unravel, the timeline itself became one of the most important pieces of the puzzle, because when people revisited the sequence of events, they started noticing gaps, moments where things moved too quickly or didn't quite connect in a way that felt natural. And timeline analysis is powerful because it removes emotion and focuses purely on structure, on cause and effect, on what happened first and what followed after, and in this case the timeline raised questions that weren't obvious during the initial wave of reactions. Because at first everything was framed through the lens of the arrest, which created a kind of tunnel vision where every past event was interpreted as leading directly to that moment. But when that tunnel vision started to widen, people began asking whether the narrative had been shaped too quickly, whether certain details had been amplified while others were overlooked. And this is where the concept of narrative framing becomes critical, because the first version of a story that people hear often has the strongest impact. It sets the tone, it establishes the roles, and it influences how every new piece of information is interpreted afterward. And in Daniel's case, the initial framing positioned him as the clear antagonist, which made it easier for the audience to accept any negative detail that surfaced about him without much resistance. But as additional context started appearing, some of that certainty began to weaken, not disappear completely, but soften just enough to create space for doubt. And doubt is where complexity enters, because once people are no longer completely sure, they start looking more carefully, they start questioning assumptions, they start considering possibilities that didn't fit the original narrative. And one of the most discussed elements during this phase was the idea of intent, because outcomes can often be measured objectively. Money was either transferred or it wasn't, promises were either fulfilled or they weren't, but intent exists in a more ambiguous space. It requires interpretation, it depends on perspective, and it can rarely be proven with absolute clarity. And this is where opinions began to diverge more sharply, because for some viewers the outcome alone was enough to define intent. If money was lost and expectations weren't met, then the intent must have been deceptive. But for others, the possibility that Daniel genuinely believed in what he was building introduced a different layer to the conversation, because if someone truly believes in a future they are describing, does that make their actions inherently dishonest, or does it make them overly optimistic to the point of being irresponsible? And this distinction may seem subtle, but it changes the entire moral framework of the situation, because there is a significant difference between deliberately misleading someone and unintentionally failing to deliver on promises that were made in good faith. And as these discussions continued, another factor began to emerge: the role of communication. Because in any relationship, especially one involving financial decisions, clarity becomes essential, and when clarity is missing, misunderstandings can quickly escalate into conflict. And from the outside, it's impossible to know exactly how those conversations unfolded, what was explicitly stated, what was implied, what was assumed. But what can be observed is the outcome, and the outcome suggests that expectations were not aligned. And misalignment in expectations is one of the most common sources of breakdown in both personal and financial relationships, because each person operates based on their own understanding of the agreement, their own interpretation of what is fair, what is promised, and what is owed. And when those interpretations don't match, friction becomes inevitable, and this friction often remains hidden until a tipping point is reached. And in this case, the tipping point manifested in legal action, which instantly transformed a private disagreement into a public spectacle. And once a situation enters the legal system, it takes on a different kind of weight, because legal outcomes carry authority, they feel definitive, they create the impression that a final judgment has been made. And for many viewers, the 600,000 figure became symbolic not just of money, but of accountability, of consequence, of a clear resolution to a complex situation. But as time passed, even that sense of resolution began to feel less absolute, because legal decisions are based on evidence presented within a specific framework they determine liability, but they don't always capture the full emotional and psychological context of a relationship, and this is where the gap between legal truth and emotional truth becomes apparent, because something can be legally defined in one way while still feeling more complicated on a human level, and as more people began exploring that gap, the conversation shifted, once again moving away from simple labels and toward deeper questions about responsibility, about awareness, about the role each person plays in the outcomes they experience. And this is where Lisa's role started being examined more closely, not in a way that removed accountability from Daniel, but in a way that recognized that relationships are rarely one-sided, and that participation itself involves a series of choices about trust, about risk, about how much weight to give to promises versus evidence. And this doesn't mean that responsibility is equal, but it does mean that understanding the full picture requires looking at both sides, not just one. And as viewers engaged with these ideas, the tone of the conversation began to evolve, becoming less about assigning blame and more about understanding dynamics, about how certain patterns repeat themselves in different forms across different relationships, and how easily those patterns can be overlooked when emotions are involved. And this shift toward pattern recognition is important because it allows people to apply the lessons of one situation to their own lives, to recognize warning signs earlier, to question narratives more critically, and to approach decisions with a greater awareness of how perception can influence judgment. And as this awareness grew, the story itself continued to expand, moving beyond the initial headline into a broader exploration of how trust is built, how it is tested, and how it can break down in ways that are not always immediately visible. And as we move into the next phase of this analysis, the focus will shift even further inward, looking not just at what happened between Daniel and Lisa, but at what their story reveals about